The shed had a padlock on it the day she found it. Not a serious padlock, one of those combo locks where somebody has taped the code to the back of it because they keep forgetting, and the tape has been there so long it's turned yellow. The shed sat at the far back corner of a lot that nobody had paid attention to in years, behind a chain link fence with a gap where the post had rusted loose at the bottom. The lot was between a shuttered tile warehouse and a car parts place that only opened on Thursdays. Nobody came back there. She knew because she had watched the lot for 11 days before she touched anything. That was Darcy Fenn's first real skill, watching before moving. She was 20 years old when she got to Tacoma in the spring of 2019. She came from Spokane. Not from a house in Spokane, she'd aged out of the foster system at 18 and had spent the next 2 years doing a kind of slow drift that a lot of people do after that. You land somewhere, you try something, it doesn't hold. You move. She had a gym bag with some clothes, a pair of waterproof boots that were already starting to separate at the sole, and $34 in her pocket when she stepped off the Greyhound on Pacific Avenue. She wasn't panicking. That's the part that's easy to miss about Darcy. She never described it as panic. She described it as problem solving with a very short timeline. Tacoma in May is cold in a way that confuses people who think of the Pacific Northwest as just rain. The rain is fine, or rain you can manage. It's the wet cold that settles in off the sound that does something different. It gets into fabric, it gets into joints, it pulls your temperature down slowly enough that you don't notice until you're in trouble. Or she noticed. She cataloged it the way you catalog things when you have no margin to get them wrong. She slept her first 3 nights in a 24-hour McDonald's on South Tacoma Way. This is not a euphemism. She sat in a booth with her bag between her feet and her back to the wall, and she slept in the kind of 40-minute intervals that your body eventually learns to accept, because there is no other option. The staff at that particular McDonald's had a policy, unofficial, just understood, where they didn't wake people unless there was a customer complaint or someone was causing a problem. Darcy caused no problems, or she bought a coffee every few hours when she could. She watched who came in and who left, and she started to understand the geography of that particular stretch of the city. On the fourth day, she found the lot. She wasn't looking for a shed specifically. She was walking the blocks east of Pacific toward the rail yard because she'd heard from a woman at the McDonald's that there was a warming shelter somewhere over that direction that was less crowded than the one downtown. She never found the shelter. What she found instead was the gap in the fence, and past it, the shed. It was maybe 12 feet by 8. Gray-painted wood siding, most of the paint peeled or lifted at the edges, a flat roof with a visible sag on the left side where water had collected and sat. 2 small windows, both intact, which surprised her. One door, hinged on the right, the combo lock looped through the hasp, or inside. Through the grimy window glass, she could see a dirt floor, a broken plastic shelving unit collapsed against the back wall, and a rusted push mower that hadn't moved in what looked like years. Spiderwebs on everything. Mouse droppings along the base of the walls. She stood there for a while, just looked at it. Then she walked away, found a spot on a concrete barrier near the rail yard, and spent the next hour thinking. Here's what she knew. The shed was on a lot that nobody used. The lock was theater. The windows were whole. The walls stood. The roof sagged, but it didn't have a hole she could see. And the fence gap meant access without spectacle. Here is what she didn't know. Who owned the lot, how often anyone checked on it, whether the city would sweep the area, and whether that roof was going to hold when the Tacoma rain season hit hard in November. She spent 11 days watching before she touched the lock. During those 11 days, she slept in a McDonald's booth, in a doorway on Commerce Street twice when the McDonald's got too crowded, and one night in the entryway of a closed laundromat when it was raining so hard the streets were running. She ate at a food pantry on MLK Way 3 times. She watched the lot every morning between 7 and 9, and every evening around 5. Nobody came. On day 12, she worked the lock off the hasp. The code was written on the tape on the back, 2841. She went inside and stood in the middle of it and counted the floor space, 12 feet by 8, 96 square feet. She stood there in the dimness with spider silk catching in her hair, and she thought, this is more than I need. The first thing she did was the floor. The dirt was hard-packed but uneven, low spots where water would pool if it got in, and she knew it would get in eventually because no shed is truly sealed. She spent 2 weeks sourcing what she needed entirely from the area within walking distance. This is where people who've never been in that situation get it wrong. They imagine you need money to fix a space. Darcy figured out early that what you actually need is time, attention, and the ability to carry things. Behind the tile warehouse next door, there was a pile of broken ceramic tile scraps in a dumpster, pieces that had cracked during shipping or storage and been thrown out. She carried them over in batches in her gym bag, wrapped in a t-shirt she sacrificed for the purpose. The pieces were irregular, some big as a dinner plate, some small as a playing card, and she laid them into the floor like a puzzle, fitting the edges together as close as she could, leaving the gaps she couldn't close. Not beautiful, but not dirt anymore. Not a surface that turned to mud when wet. She found a bag of grout powder, partially used, dried to a solid brick on one end, but still workable in the middle. In the dumpster behind the car parts place, she mixed it with water in an old paint can and pressed it into the tile gaps with a scrap of wood. She did this on a Saturday in late June of 2019, the first summer. She had been in Tacoma about 6 weeks. The floor cost her nothing. The time it took her was close to 3 weeks of work, doing it in pieces, carrying materials at dawn before the area got any foot traffic. The walls were next. The siding was original wood, the kind of thin-lapped boards that were everywhere in older Tacoma structures, and they were drafty in the way that old wood siding always is, the caulking long gone, gaps at every seam, wide enough to feel cold air move through when you pressed your palm flat against them. She needed insulation, but she wasn't about to pay for it, and she didn't know yet what the long solution was. What she found first was cardboard. There's a specific kind of person who doesn't take cardboard seriously as a building material, and that person has never spent a night in a 38-degree shed. Darcy had. She tested the shed in early June of 2019 on a cold night and understood exactly what uninsulated wood walls meant in practice. Cardboard in thick layers, stapled to the interior walls with a hand stapler she found at Goodwill for $2. Doesn't look like much. It is not a permanent solution. What it does is create a dead air layer between the cold wall and the interior space, and dead air is a terrible conductor of cold. She covered 3 walls completely. The fourth, the one with the door, she left mostly open for access. Then she found the foam. This took until August of that first year. She was walking the stretch of Industrial Way near the shipping yard when she passed a construction dumpster outside a building being gutted. Sitting on top, not even inside the dumpster, just balanced on the rim, were 4 sheets of rigid foam board insulation, the pink kind, 2 inches thick. Each sheet was 4 feet by 8 feet. Someone had tossed them because they'd been cut down and weren't big enough for whatever the job required. They were perfect. She carried 2 sheets at a time, balanced across her arms, walking the 6 blocks back to the shed with the foam swaying in the wind coming off the port. She looked, she admitted later, completely ridiculous. She made 2 trips. It took her most of a day. The foam went over the cardboard on the walls. She cut it with a serrated bread knife she'd gotten at Goodwill, where she used construction adhesive, a partial tube found in the same construction dumpster, to stick the foam to the cardboard. Where the foam didn't reach, the cardboard stayed. The combination dropped the interior temperature differential by something she couldn't measure precisely but could feel clearly. What had been a through draft became still air. Still air. That's the whole game, in cold. She was 3 months into the shed when she decided she needed a second room. This decision came directly from one specific problem: the mower. She had moved the broken push mower to the corner when she first moved in, and she'd been using it as a kind of shelf, hanging things off its handle, setting things on its deck. But it was also a space problem. The 96 square feet of the shed felt different once she'd laid the tile floor and lined the walls. It felt like a real interior, which meant it also felt crowded in a way the bare shed hadn't. She needed somewhere to put the things that didn't need to be in her living space. The extra tile pieces she'd kept as reserves, tools she'd accumulated, the cardboard she hadn't used yet. She built a partition wall. She sourced lumber from 2 places. The tile warehouse next door was being slowly emptied by a company that came on Tuesdays. She started watching when they worked and realized they were pulling material from the front and the sides and never went to the back of the property. Doors. Along the back wall there was a pile of wood pallet boards, the kind that had been used to ship tile in on, that nobody had touched. She started taking boards one at a time, Tuesdays after the company left. She took 12 boards over 4 weeks. This is how you do it when you can't carry much at once. She nailed the partition frame together with nails she pulled from the pallet boards themselves, straightened on the tile floor with a piece of rebar she'd found in the dumpster. This is a skill people used to know, pulling nails from old wood and straightening them. Most people now don't know you can reuse a nail if you straighten it. Darcy figured it out by trial and error and bent 7 nails for every one she got right, then got faster at it. The partition wall went up on a cold Saturday in October 2019. It didn't reach the ceiling. She built it to about 6.5 feet, leaving a gap at the top for air circulation. It divided the shed into roughly 2/3 and 1/3, a larger main room where she slept and kept her things, and a smaller back room where she stored everything else. 2 rooms. In a shed that cost her $0 to move into. The $200 came later. We'll get to that. Her first winter, November 2019. The Tacoma rain that year came in hard in the second week of November, not the light constant drizzle that most people think of when they think Pacific Northwest rain, but the kind that comes sideways off the sound in the early morning and hits everything at the same angle, for 6 hours at a time. She was in the shed when the first real storm came through, lying on the sleeping bag she'd picked up at a church donation event, listening to the rain hit the flat roof. The roof. She had known about the sag since the beginning. She had watched it through the first summer without doing anything because she didn't have a solution yet. The sag was on the left side toward the back, and it was where the roofing material, a layer of rolled asphalt, the cheap flat roof covering, had cracked along the seam and lifted at one edge. During heavy rain, it pooled there first. She heard it start to drip at about 2 in the morning, a slow, single drip, then faster. By 3, it was a steady pour into the corner of her back room, running down the foam-covered wall and pooling on the tile. She spent the rest of that night with a pot from her camp kit catching water and a flashlight in her mouth trying to see how bad it was. It wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't fine either. She fixed the roof in December 2019 with a $12 roll of aluminum tape, the wide kind, 4 inches used to seal HVAC ductwork, and a tube of roof repair caulk that cost $8 at a hardware store on South Tacoma Way. She walked to that hardware store on a Tuesday morning in the rain. She had $26 in her pocket. After she bought the tape and the caulk, and she came back and she climbed up onto the shed roof and the chain link fence, and she worked in the rain for 2 hours, pressing the aluminum tape flat over the cracked seam and running caulk along every lifted edge she could find. The roof held through the rest of that winter, and the next winter, and the 2 after that. $20. The leak was fixed for $20. She was not warm that first winter. Let's be clear about that. She was not cold in the way that kills. There is a difference, and she knew it because she'd done her research. Not online, not from a book, but from a woman named Patrice, who stayed at the warming shelter on MLK Way, and who had been living outside and in structures across Tacoma for 8 years by that point. Patrice told her 3 things that first November, and all 3 of them are right. 1. The floor is where you lose the most heat, not the walls. You can pile on every blanket you own, and if you're lying on a cold surface, you will keep getting colder because the ground pulls heat through anything, sleeping bag, cardboard, blanket, faster than still air loses it through a wall. 2. Wet is the thing that kills, not cold. Wet clothing in 40-degree air is more dangerous than dry clothing in 20-degree air. The insulation value of fabric drops to almost nothing when it's saturated. 3. You have to eat enough. This sounds obvious, and it isn't. When your body is working to maintain temperature in a cold environment, it burns more than you think. And if you're not taking in enough food, you will feel the cold harder than someone who is, even in the same conditions. Patrice said she had watched people get hypothermic in temperatures they should have been fine in, and when she looked at what they'd eaten that day, it was nothing, or close to nothing. Darcy took all 3 of these seriously. For the floor, she had the tile, which helped, but she built a platform. She used the last of the pallet boards, 3 boards wide placed across 2 runners she cut from a 4th board, to get herself up off the tile by about 4 inches. An old yoga mat she found at Goodwill went on top of the boards, her sleeping bag on top of that. The platform cost her nothing, just time. The yoga mat cost $3. She stayed dry by keeping her wet gear in the back room always, never in the main room. She had a dedicated hook, a bent nail pounded into the partition wall, where wet things went the moment she walked in. She changed her socks every day without exception, even when it felt absurd, because Patrice had told her that wet feet will wreck you faster than anything else, and she had believed her. The food was harder. She used the pantry on MLK Way twice a week and supplemented with whatever she could find. The McDonald's on Pacific still occasionally. One of the churches that did a Saturday meal, a Safeway a few blocks away, where she learned which markdown times were reliable. She went to bed on enough calories every night of that first winter. She was hungry sometimes, not dangerously. She was cold in the shed, but never in a way that scared her. She made it to March. The second winter, she had more. By fall of 2020, she had been in the shed for a year and 4 months. And she had learned the rhythms of the lot, the neighborhood, the city's sweep schedules. She had a job, cash irregular, through a woman at the food pantry who connected people to day labor when she could. Darcy worked enough through that summer to save over several months, a little over $200. This is the $200. She did not spend it all at once. She had a list she'd been building for months of the things that would make the most actual difference to surviving the second winter better than the first. Not comfort things, survival margin things. The distinction mattered to her. The list, in order of what she bought: a Mr. Heater Buddy propane heater, used, from Facebook Marketplace, $55. The Buddy heater runs on those 1-pound propane canisters, and it has an auto shutoff if the oxygen in a space gets too low. She knew this because she'd looked it up on the library computers on Commerce Street before she bought it. She was not going to use a heater in an enclosed space without knowing how it worked. She bought it, she cracked one window 2 inches whenever she ran it, and she ran it for 30 minutes before bed on nights that dropped below 40, for just enough to push the interior temperature up before she got into the sleeping bag. A second sleeping bag, also used, from Goodwill, $14. She nested them, outer bag, inner bag, on the coldest nights. The combination dropped the minimum temperature she felt comfortable sleeping in by a lot. She didn't have a thermometer, so she can't give you a number. What she can tell you is that January 2021 in Tacoma was cold enough that the water in the plastic bottle she kept by her bed had a skin of ice on it in the mornings, and she was sleeping fine. A battery-powered LED lantern, $18 from a liquidation store on South Tacoma Way. She had been using a flashlight until then and burning through batteries fast, and the lantern changed the interior completely in a way she hadn't anticipated. Not just the light, but what the light did to how the space felt. She'd had bare flashlight light for a year. The lantern spread it evenly. The room felt real. She spent the rest of the $200, the remaining $113, on propane canisters bought in packs of 4 when they were on sale, on a proper waterproof tarp she secured over the shed roof as an extra water barrier before November, and on 2 pairs of wool socks from a sporting goods store liquidation sale, $9 each. That was it. That was the $200 in its entirety. The second winter was different. Not easy, different. She was in the shed when a cold snap came through in February 2021 that pushed night temperatures down to 26 degrees in Tacoma. The kind of cold that doesn't usually last more than 3 days in that part of Washington, but feels serious while it's happening. She ran the Buddy heater twice that night, once at 9 p.m., once at 1 a.m. when she woke up and the sleeping bag was no longer enough. She cracked the window both times. She watched the little green indicator light on the heater. It stayed green. She went back to sleep. She was fine. There is something specific about knowing you've built the thing well enough that you can trust it. Or she would describe it later, much later, to someone who asked, as the difference between hoping the weather didn't get bad and knowing she had already dealt with the weather getting bad. The work she'd done on the walls, the roof, the floor, the sleeping setup, it had all been about closing the gap between what the environment could do and what she could handle. By the second winter, she'd closed enough of it that she could sleep through a 26-degree night in a shed she found for free. By the third winter, she had heat in both rooms. She'd sourced a second Buddy heater from a guy at the day labor pickup who was clearing out a storage unit. He sold it to her for $30, which was the last money she spent on the shed. She put the first heater in the main room, the second in the back room, and ran them on a rotation. She didn't actually need both rooms heated at the same time. She was in the main room at night, in the back room mostly during the day when she was doing things, mending clothes, reading, writing in the journal she'd started. But having heat in the back room meant she wasn't walking from warm air to cold air every time she got up, and that mattered more than she expected. The partition wall had acquired things by then. She'd hung a piece of dark canvas, an old drop cloth found, over it, which helped with draft, and also made the main room feel enclosed in a way that felt, she said, like a room and not a construction. A real room, not a shed. She had been in this shed for 2 years, and the running cost of her living situation, counting everything she'd ever spent on the space itself, was around $230. She had a neighbor. By the fourth winter, there was a man named Cass, she never knew his last name, who had been sleeping rough in the rail yard area and who had started talking to her near the lot fence in late summer of 2022. He was 28, had been in Tacoma off and on for 3 years, and he had figured out she was living in the shed because he'd seen her lights and smelled the propane. He asked if there was room for two. There wasn't, not in the main room, but the back room was 8 feet by about 5.5, roughly 40 square feet. And she told him he could use it if he had his own sleeping situation and kept his things to his own side of the partition. He did. He had a sleeping bag and a duffel, and he was, she said, very quiet. They split propane costs that winter. He paid $20, she paid $20. They had enough canisters to last to March, or she told me. And I want to be specific about this because it's the part that people miss when they hear this story, that having another person in the building changed the temperature. Not just the literal temperature, though. Two bodies in an insulated space do put out heat, but the feeling of the space she'd been alone in that shed for 3 winters. She knew every sound it made. She knew the way the rain hit the aluminum tape on the roof differently than it hit the tarp, the way the wind came through the fence gap and moved the canvas on the partition wall. She'd gotten used to knowing all of it by herself. Having someone else there meant someone else heard those things too. That was different. There she left the shed in April 2023. She'd been working more consistently by then. Not day labor anymore. She had gotten a steady position through a contact she'd made at the food pantry, working morning prep at a cafe on 6th Avenue that opened at 6 a.m. She had saved enough over the previous 8 months to pay first and last month's rent on a room in a shared house in the Hilltop neighborhood, north of downtown. The room was small, smaller than the main room of the shed actually, which she found strange for a minute before she adjusted. She put the key back in the combo lock before she left, set it to 2841, and looped it through the hasp the way she'd found it. She didn't take much with her. They're the buddy heater she sold to Cass for $15. He stayed in the shed for 2 more months after she left, until he got connected to transitional housing in May. The sleeping bag she donated to the same church she'd gotten food from, their lantern she kept. She still has it. There is one thing about the shed that she goes back to, and I think it's worth sitting with. She describes the first winter, the hard one, November 2019 to March 2020, before the heater and the nested bags and the propane, not as the worst part, but as the part where she figured out what she was actually capable of. She had spent the year before she got to Tacoma in a kind of fog, moving, not quite connecting, not quite settling. She had arrived in Tacoma with $34 in a bag and no plan, and that had felt like failure. It had felt like the end of something. Then she found the shed, and she started solving problems. The tile floor took 3 weeks and cost her nothing. The foam insulation was free. The roof cost $20. The second winter cost $200 total. And every time she fixed something, she understood the next thing more clearly than she had before. The shed wasn't a last resort. It turned into a method, a way of moving through a problem systematically with no money and a lot of time until the problem was solved. She is 25 now. She lives in the shared house in Hilltop. She is not rich. She is not struggling either. She pays her rent on time. She is saving. She told me she thinks about the shed sometimes on mornings when the Tacoma rain comes in sideways off the sound. Not with sadness, more like she checks it mentally. Like she knows that if something went wrong tomorrow, job, rent, everything, she already knows how to handle a floor. She already knows us to stay dry before staying warm. She knows what a 26-degree February night in an insulated shed feels like, and she came through it.